If you follow me on Instagram, you might have seen me make this post a couple of months ago. Now that video got a fair number of views, and naturally along with that, a fair number of critiques as well. Most of them surrounding why I didn't have a bass trombone featured in that section of me overdubbing it. There's a simple answer. I don't have a bass trombone. I'm not a bass trombone player. I don't have a bass trombone at my disposal. And so I didn't include it. Sometimes you just got to make do with what you got. I think it's a fair comment. We want to have that full section sound, but in that case, I just couldn't make it happen. But the other comment, and what brings us to today's video, is that a number of people across a couple platforms asked, well, how do you write in this style? So today we are actually going to look at how we write for 4 trombones, either in a quartet or in a big band setting. All right, just a couple of pieces of information before we jump into things. The first is that you're going to hear all of today's examples played by a real trombone section. I think that's really important when we're talking about this stuff. Yes, we could just do it in MIDI or we could do it on the piano, but I think you'll get so much more to really understand why we make some of the arranging choices if you hear it from a real section. You're going to have me playing lead. Some colleagues are going to fill out the section. We've got Paul Nabalski on second, Christian Lund on third, and Dr. Pete Madsen on bass. So we will have a full section for these examples today. Also, if you want to really get into the details, which is important as an arranger, make sure to check out the virtual studio. There are some handouts that will be really useful. All of the examples today will include some analysis that you can check out if you really wanted to get into the score study aspect of this, and there'll be like a worksheet that you can use to help practice some of these skills. The second thing is that this is a pretty deep dive today. You're going to see this is a relatively long lesson, so make sure you are checking out the chapter markers so that you can kind of find some of the information you might be looking for. And if you're here just for the trombone playing, maybe you don't care about arranging, or maybe you already know how to do some of this arranging stuff, but you'd love to hear the examples. I included those in the chapter markers as well, where we have like a more lengthy example so you can really hear like, okay, well, what does it sound like if I'm using a 4-way closed voicing versus what does it sound like if I use some drop twos and some spread voicing? So you can really hear those examples and see what is going on. Today, we're going to focus mostly on sort of the technical and mechanical aspects of how we create these different voicings, how we make these choices, but I'll also give you a little bit of insight about why you might want to make some of these choices. Why do I write a 4-way closed voicing versus a drop 2 voicing? Or, why do I choose to reharmonize something in a certain way? These things are important, but if you really want to get inside this stuff, you got to go to the scores, you got to do score study, you got to go to the recordings, hopefully with the scores, and really see, well, why did Sammy Nestico do this in a certain way? Or why did Thad Jones do this in a certain way? Or why did Bob Brookmeyer do this in a certain way? All those people have similar but somewhat different styles of writing that are all sort of in the middle part of the body of being a jazz arranger, and we really want to understand both technically and orally why we might make some of those choices. With all that out of the way, let's get into it. So we are going to start with the most simple type of writing, and that is unison. Unison is the most underutilized thing, especially by younger or less experienced arrangers, because as soon as you get the skills to start harmonizing things, you think you got to harmonize everything. But unison is an incredibly important thing to know how to utilize, and more importantly, to know when to utilize it. It's obviously great for melodies, but it's also particularly effective, in my opinion, for counter melody material, especially when you want to maintain clarity. If you are arranging a piece that has lots of densely orchestrated stuff, maybe the saxophones are doing one thing, the trumpets are doing another thing, the trombones are doing another thing, it can be pretty tough to make sure everybody has space to exist if they're all fully harmonized. So it's great if some of those voices are maybe working in unison so that clarity can be maintained. Unison is also great for fast moving lines, and particularly if you're working with some melodic material that's maybe stretching the harmony a little bit outside of the chord changes. Sometimes those things can be difficult to make them harmonized in a way that all sort of works and feels appealing. Unisons are great in those situations. However, when we get to sort of the real world, very rarely, or I shouldn't say very rarely, but very often, we see unison in combination with some harmonized figures, where some stuff is in unison, and then some things will break into harmony. In that example, we started in unison, and as the melody ascended and we reached sort of an impact spot, bam, we spread out into harmony. That's sort of a satisfying resolution to that short phrase. Now, obviously, there's not necessarily a ton of technique here when it comes to writing unison, so we're going to go right to our longer example. So what I would pay attention for as you're listening here, and if you're following along with any of the sort of analyzed material, is A, check out when we're in unison and when we split into harmony, But then also in the latter half of this example, you're going to hear where we have two things happening. We have sort of a melody and a counter melody. That's again a very useful place to have some unison happening. You're going to hear one part in the first and second trombone, and then you'll hear a different part in the third and fourth trombone. Both of them are in unison, and they'll eventually, again, split to harmony at that like impact moment near the very end. All right, so what about those places where we did split into harmony? That's, I think, what most people really want to know is how do we write in this harmonized fashion in a jazz context. So we're going to start by talking about the most important type of voicing. This is a four-way closed voicing. This is the foundation. This is what all the other voicings, for the most part, will be based on. And so it is four-way closed because there are four voices, and it's a closed voicing because it's all going to exist in an octave of space. So we're not going to be spread out farther than an octave for these type of voicings. These work well for really almost all types of things, but they're particularly effective when you want kind of a tight, punchy sounding line. They're great for fast moving lines because everything is relatively contained range-wise, and they're also very effective as the range starts to get a little bit low. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So let's look at an example here. We're going to start on a G minor 7 chord. When we're talking about four-way close, this is a top-down approach to voicing chords. So it's very important that we know the melody note here. So we've got a G minor 7 chord. Let's say our melody note is an F natural. That is the flat 7 of the chord. So we are simply going to voice down through the chord. We've got the flat 7. Next voice down is going to be the 5th, the D natural. Next voice down is going to be a B flat, the flat 3rd. And then the last voice is going to be a G, the root. And then we just distribute those notes to the various parts. So first gets the F, second gets the D, third gets the B flat, G goes in the bass trombone. So pretty straightforward here. And that's what we want to think about with this four-way closed style of writing. It really is a very efficient way of voicing these chords. Even as the range is getting a little bit higher, say we're up on a B flat now on that G minor chord, we're still going to take the same approach. B flat is the flat 3rd. The next voice down would be the root. The next voice down would be the flat 7. And the next voice down would be the 5th. So again, I distribute those parts, or those notes, to the different parts, and there we have our four-way closed voicing. Before we look at a more musical example and analyze how we put that together, there's one extra little consideration we need to do. That is something called the lower interval limit. So if you look at the first couple bars of our example on Dear Old Stockholm harmonized here, that first note, you can see I still left it as a unison. Now, this is partially a subjective sort of like creative choice where I want that unison at the beginning, then I want it to spread out as we go, but it's also a very practical choice. So if I harmonized that voice, I would have a G, that's my root in the lead, and then I'd have the flat 7 in the second, that's an F. I'd have the 5th, the D in the 3rd, and I'd have the low B flat in the bass trombone. Now, that's a G minor chord. We also have to envision that there is sort of an imaginary bass note below that because realistically, it's very likely the bass might be playing that bass note, or even if it isn't, we still want to think that that bass note exists below that. That means that there's a minor 3rd between the G to the B flat and the bottom part of that chord. That is too low for a minor 3rd to exist with clarity. So there is a chart that you could find anywhere online. Search for the lower interval limit chart. It's going to tell you what intervals can exist between the lowest note in a voicing and the root of the chord. I wouldn't worry too much about memorizing this necessarily. If you want to get into arranging, I would just like print off that chart or whatever. I used to have it like tacked to my bulletin board when I was a younger arrangement. Now I know that stuff relatively well, so sometimes I'll have to check. But as a general rule, you want to try to keep wider intervals in the bottom of the chord. Fifths are great, octaves are great, sevenths can be cool, but it's all about what is the lowest note in the voicing compared to where the bass note is. Thirds can be cool, but you can't go too much below an E flat or a D if you want to have a third, or you're going to start to lose some clarity in the voicing. It's going to start to sound a little muddy. Once we kind of sort out our lower interval limit, we want to just look at some of these measures and see how we're going to harmonize them. So I would start by looking for all of the non-chord tones. So in our first couple of measures here, if I take a look, we've got a G, that's a chord tone. A natural, non-chord tone. I'm not going to worry about that to start with. B flat, downbeat of 3, that is a chord tone, so we can harmonize that. We keep going, there's a C, that's a non-chord tone. Now, the D that's tied over the bar line, since it's in anticipation of the next chord, that D in the melody is actually going to go with the next chord, which is a D7 chord. That is a chord tone. And the rest of that measure, we've got a G. That's a non-chord tone. And then the same thing happens on the and of 4. Because that is an and of 4 followed by a rest in this case, that and of 4 anticipates the next chord. In this case, it's a C minor chord. I made it a C minor 6, so that A natural is in that chord. So we've got to take stock of where those chord tones are first. We're going to start with those. We'll get to the non-chord tones in a second. And then I just do my four-way close procedure. Let's just look at one of these notes. Let's look at the D natural on the D7 chord. The D natural is the root. So then I know I've got a flat 7, that's the next voice down. I've got a 5th, which is an A natural, the next voice down. And then I have an F sharp, which is the next voice down. So that gives me my four-way close voicing. All right, let's hear through our entire example with this four-way close style of writing. Now, I do want you to keep in mind there are no extensions or alterations in here yet. I do have the non-harmonic tones harmonized, which we'll get to how we understand that in a second, but very important to understand that this example is going to have no extensions or alterations. I should have added that I marked all the non-chord tones in red there. Very important that we identify those before we harmonize any passage. So that sounded fine. It didn't sound wrong, maybe a little dry, not quite as harmonically rich or dense as we might expect from a big band chart. That is where adding some extensions, some alterations comes in. So when we do this procedure, some arrangers would refer to this as subbing out some of the voices. So when we have a root in our chord, we can sub that out for any type of 9 that is appropriate for the given chord. When we have a 5th of any chord, we can sub that out for an 11 or a 13. Again, any type of 11 or 13 as long as it is appropriate for the chord that we are working on. How we actually voice these is exactly the same as we would if we were doing four-way close. So let's check out a four-way close voicing on a D7 chord. We're going to have an F sharp in the melody. So if we just do standard four-way close, we've got F sharp, we have a D, we have a C, and we have an A. If we want to find a little more harmonic richness, we can sub out the root, the D natural, for an E natural. That is the natural 9 of this chord. If either we want from a creative choice or maybe the chord nomenclature says we should have a flat 9, we do the same procedure where that D becomes an E flat. We could also sub out the 5th voice if we wanted to. In this case, I'm going to sub that A natural for a G sharp to give me the D7 sharp 11 sound. Now, there isn't a right or wrong choice here when you're talking about adding extensions. There are times when no extensions are appropriate. There are times when you want to add some. Now, I can tell you the general guideline that I like to use is I usually try to add one extension to most chords when I'm writing in sort of a straight ahead jazz context. That I think is going to be most typical. Most often that is the 9. Instead of having a root, I'm going to have a 9, but there might be times where instead of having a 5, I might have a 13. That's not a rule, just a good guideline to work with and somewhere that will get you started. Now, one thing to consider, there are times when you absolutely don't necessarily want to add an extension. One of them that comes to mind is that when the flat third is in the is in the lead voice on a minor chord, so say we're playing a B flat on a G minor 7 chord, you do not want to take that G and move it up to an A natural that is in that chord, because then we're going to have a B flat in the lead voice and have an A natural somewhere else in the chord. That's going to be a half-step rub between those two voices. It's going to sound relatively dissonant. If you want that dissonant sound, that's totally cool, but as a general rule, you probably would not want to have a half-step against the lead voice. So there are times where you don't necessarily want to sub out a voice in order to maintain sort of like some uniformity in the voicings that are happening. All of this stuff would also be true if the melody note happened to be an extension or an alteration. So let's look at this in context. Let's take the first couple bars of the example we've been dealing with, the first couple measures of Dear Old Stockholm. Let's listen to it once with no subbed out notes, all just straight up four-way close, which we already heard. And then we will hear it again with some notes subbed out. I will mark all the sub out notes with red so you can see the changes. There's not a ton of changes. There's just going to be one, maybe two notes that are changing per voicing. We're going to go slow through these so you can really hear the color change between the two examples. The difference is definitely subtle, but it's certainly there. And if you're feeling like some of your writing is maybe a little stale, this is a great way to make sure it has the color that you're looking for. It's also very useful when you're trying to make good parts, internal parts, to make sure that people have not too many repeated notes or they have a nice moving line. By just doing some subtle changes with how you use alterations and extensions, you can really create better internal parts. So let's hear the entire example here. I will mark all of the sub-outs in red. All right, how you doing? Lots of content here, so make sure you're trying to digest this in a reasonable way. These first couple things of understanding four-way close and understanding how to sub out some of those voices, that is really the most important stuff. But we are going to move on to a couple of different type of voicings, and then we'll get to those non-harmonic tones last. So we're going to talk about these other types of voicings. There's a few reasons why you might want to use, a voicing that is not a four-way close voicing. These are all going to be wider voicings that cover more range. Maybe if range is becoming an issue, the lead trombone is getting particularly high, you don't want the bass trombone player to have to play that high. Maybe you want the section to sound a little wider. A lot of times people think if we have a bigger voice or a bigger distance, between the lowest note in a voicing and the highest note, that section is going to sound bigger. Now, it's definitely going to sound wider, and that can give us a sense of bigness. Not necessarily going to sound louder in my perspective, but it can sound a little bit wider. And it can be really great to have some of these bigger voicings at really key moments, just for a little bit of variety and to draw attention to those key moments. These type of voicings are really effective for us as trombone players when we are playing sort of like the punchy background rhythmic figures that are so much a part of how the trombone functions in the big band. Really, really effective there. They can be less effective on faster moving lines. It's not that you never use them, but because the range is wider, they can sometimes not be as nimble, and you can also run into that lower interval limit very, very easily. So just be thoughtful when you're kind of applying these type of voicings. The first alternate type of voicing we're going to talk about is a drop 2. So with this voicing, we start with a four-way close. We're again going to look at the example of a D7 chord with an F sharp as the melody. So we're going to create a four-way close that is an F sharp, an E natural, that's a subbed out root, a C, and an A natural. Since this is called a drop 2, the second voice, we're simply going to move down an octave. We're dropping it an octave. And then the other two voices are going to bump up a part. So that E natural is going to become an E natural in the staff. And that's going to go in the fourth part. The note that was in the third part is going to jump up to the second part. And the note that was in the fourth part is going to jump up to the third part. That is going to give us our drop 2 voicing. So let's listen to the difference between a four-way close and a drop 2 on this example. It's relatively subtle, but you're definitely going to hear it. If we want an even wider voicing still, we can just do this procedure again and do a drop 2, drop 4. So now we're going to drop both the second voice and the fourth voice down an octave from where they would originally be in a four-way close. So again, if we look at our four-way close voicing, F sharp, E natural, C natural, A natural. The second voice, the E, is going to move down an octave. The fourth voice, which is in the bass trombone already, is also going to move down an octave. So then we're going to have a high F sharp, a C above the staff, an E in the staff, and then an A on the bottom of the staff. That's getting pretty low, but we've got to remember our imaginary root is a D. So that would be like the D below the staff. So we have a D against an A natural, a fifth at the bottom of that chord. So that's still going to be a relatively stable and clear sounding voice, because remember, we want to hear those open intervals at the bottom of the chord. So this would be a very effective drop 2, drop 4 voicing. If we want a wider voicing still, we can go to a spread voicing or a rooted voicing. This is really where the bass trombone comes into play, and I think is really the sound that we think of like the bass trombone in the trombone section. So the bass trombone here is going to have the root of the chord. That's what makes it a spread voicing. So again, we're looking at D7. So bass trombone will have a D. We also are going to know our melody note. In this case, I'm going to make it an F natural. We're going to make this a D7 sharp 9 chord. This is a very classic way to voice this sharp 9 chord, particularly in a big impact moment, is with a spread. To create a spread voicing, you got to know the bass, you got to know the melody note, and then you want a complete chord, meaning that we have both the third and the seventh presents as well. So our internal voices in this case are going to fill in those two other notes, the third and the seventh. That's not always the case, but here it's going to be. Now, Here, we're going to voice that in a relatively evenly spread out fashion. We'll have the D on the bottom, the F sharp in the staff in the middle in the third part, the C above the staff in the second, and then the high F on top. Sometimes that will be not so evenly spaced. You might get more of the chord near the top of the voicing and then a relatively large space, large interval between the third part and the fourth part, and that is totally fine. Depending on what the melody note is, sometimes the third or seventh might be in the melody and you have to make a choice about what that other note is, but here that is not the case. So that gives us this sort of sound, very identifiable. All right, let's look at this in an example. Now, rather than doing this on the melody, we are actually going to look at a passage that feels more like those punchy rhythmic background figures that we often play as trombone players. There's a little, maybe a bit of counter melody in there as well. We're going to hear a mix of some drop twos, maybe some drop two, drop four, definitely some spread in here. When you're writing in this style, you're not really necessarily using just one of these types of voicings. It's all in there, including four-way close, and you got to know when to go to one to the other. I would say the best advice I can give you, the spread voicing is really useful on a big impact moment, especially on a long chord or maybe like a short note dot at the end of a phrase. Those drop two, drop fours are a little bit more functional. You know, maybe if a melody line is ascending, particularly if it has a jump up, that is a great place to have a drop two or drop four. So that way we're kind of moving along with the voicing. When we have that jump up, the voicing spreads out and then maybe eventually it comes back together. Really, really common way to use this, but it's subjective. You got to kind of look for the places that you think sound the best for widening out that voicing. And finally, we have arrived at our non-chord tones. So to work with the non-chord tones in any line, you gotta have a little finesse, a little creativity. There's not like a one-size-fits-all approach that's gonna get you through every situation. A couple of the approaches we talk about today are gonna get you through most things, but you gotta be creative, sometimes be open to sort of reharmonizing things in maybe a different way or sort of stretching some of these rules to kind of make things work. Our first way that we're going to look at to handle non-chord tones are called diatonic or chromatic approach tones. So we want to start just like anything else where we identify our chord tones and our non-chord tones. We're going to look at just a nice little scalar line here to keep things a little bit more straightforward with this. We're going to be in B flat major. So if you look at this line, we have G, F, E flat, D, C, B flat, right down the scale. Our F, our D, and our B flat are all chord tones. And then our other notes, we're going to say are non-chord tones. Some of them we could explain with extensions and use that approach, but here we're going to treat them as non-chord tones. Once we have harmonized those chord tones, we're going to think about moving those shapes up or down diatonically or chromatically. So let's just look at our first one. So the first chord has an F, or our first chord tone has an F in the lead. So it's going to be an F, then a D, then a C, then an A natural for our B flat voicing. Since our lead line goes up a diatonic note for the previous note, it goes up to a G, all of our other chord tones are going to do the same thing, where they just move diatonically up the scale to get to their next note. So it's going to be that first chord is harmonized in something that is not really B flat, but diatonic to B flat, and then eventually resolves to B flat on the next chord. Now, I should point out that you can kind of go either way, up or down. You can kind of come from a well-voiced inside chord and keep that shape moving down to a non-chord tone, or you can have that shape move up to the non-chord tone. It really works both ways. Like I said, you got to be a little creative about how you finesse some of those things. So we take that same procedure, move it through all the different non-chord tones, and we get something that sounds like this. This approach is very effective in many situations. As I said, you can do it diatonically or chromatically, particularly when you're harmonizing like bebop-oriented lines and there's a lot of chromaticism. That chromatic approach is very, very important. It does have its shortcomings. For example, if we look at the third note in our little example, we have an E flat in the melody, but then when we harmonize in this way, we get a D natural in the second voice. That is a half step against the lead, and we've already talked about that's something we generally want to avoid. Now, in this case, it probably wouldn't be that big of a deal. It's going to be a little tension and then release, but that might be a place where you might want to approach that note in a slightly different way in order to avoid that issue if that dissonance isn't something that you want. The second way that we can think about these non-chord tones, and this is probably the one that I go to most often, is what people might refer to as a dominant approach, or I would really just think about it as a reharm approach. So what we're going to do, we're in the key of B flat here. We're going to think about what is my 5 of B flat. In this case, it's an F7 chord, so it's an F, A, C, E flat. We could also include some of the extensions in there if we wanted to. And we think, okay, my non-harmonic tones or non-chord tones, can they be harmonized with any of those notes? And in our case here, for our example, they can. The G is the 9 of F7, the E flat is the flat 7, the C is the 5th. So each one of those notes, we just momentarily reharmonize it as an F7 chord and then voice that chord accordingly as 4-way close, drop 2, whatever we want to do. The rhythm section, they might just be playing B flat the whole time, but above them, they're going to have sort of a tension and release thing happening, which is actually going to be pretty appealing. So if we do this procedure, that ends up sounding like this. That's all straight up F7. If we want to really make things a little bit interesting and find some different colors in here, we can start to use some different extensions or different alterations on all those little F7 reharms to kind of get some interesting results. As I said, this isn't limited to dominant chords. One of the most important ones that I don't think I really realized was useful until way later in my career was understanding that you can use the 4 chord to do the same thing. So rather than thinking about 5 going to B flat, you think about 4 going to B flat, which is an E flat chord. This is particularly useful when you have blues-oriented ideas. Going 4 to 1, where that 4 is the temporary reharm, is just absolutely essential to making sure that you find those blues sounds. So let's listen to an example here. This is going to be a soli section. So this stuff, this non-harmonic tone writing, is very, very important when you have fast-moving 8th note lines, because obviously you're going to have a fair number of non-chord tones in those 8th note lines oftentimes. So I've marked all of the non-chord tones in red and marked whether they were a dominant approach, a diatonic approach, chromatic, all that kind of stuff, so you can kind of follow along. All right, we made it. We're here all the way at the end. That is a long one, lots of information there. This is something, I could talk about all day because I love arranging. Arranging is actually like one of my favorite things, almost more than trombone playing sometimes. I do a lot of writing for small group, quite a bit of writing for big band, and definitely over my career have done a lot of writing for big band. So if you really want to get into this, you got to take some time to do some score study. It is absolutely essential. In some ways, I would equate it to transcription for us as soloists. Score study is kind of what you need to do as an arranger, and like listening to those scores while you can actually see what's going on, so you can understand like, oh, I like this section. How does this work? You really got to get under the hood to understand this stuff. If you want a resource to do that, check out the book Inside the Score. It is a book that has, I think, 6 or 8 charts in it by some of, the most common arrangers, Thad Jones, Sammy Nestico, that kind of stuff. And it has them with large chunks of them in concert pitch, where they're already transposed, so they're easy to analyze, and it even has some of the sections analyzed for you. So it's a very, very good resource to kind of understand, again, this sort of like mechanical and technical side of arranging. You got to sort out the creative side for yourself, but understanding the technical aspect comes from score study. Cool. We'll see you in the woodshed.